The Think Good podcast, where therapists talk about TV shows, movies, books, and life.
Hello, and welcome back to the Think Good podcast. It's Thayeba here, and Ankor's with us today. We are super stoked about today's episode. We are going to be talking about the TikTok diagnosis epidemic. So, really excited about this episode. Really just going to get into I'm not going to call them children to age myself, but all the individuals who are kind of coming in using social media, TikTok specifically, to get some mental health diagnoses. We're going to talk about that. So I think it's going to be a really, really great episode.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about this both as therapists and what we see with our clients, as well as kind of just how we are as consumers of social media and how it can impact us. So, a couple different things that I'm excited to get into around this. Can you tell us, like, you suggested this as something for us to talk about? Tell me what brought this up for you, and just any thoughts initially around what this actually is.
Yeah, so I have a couple of reasons why I was excited to do this episode. One, I just had a number of Gen Zers. What is that? That's like 13, I think it's like 13 to 27 or 28, just coming in. So I see adults. So I'm really talking about that like 18 to 28 range of clients coming in and saying, hey, I'm looking at the intake paperwork. They're saying they have OCD, autism, borderline personality disorder. And I'm thinking, wow, like, so the first couple of times that happened, I was like, wow, like they must have gotten like extensive assessment and testing. Like,
Mm.
how do you have like 8 diagnoses at such a young age? Like, unless you went through this like rigorous battery only to then do the actual sessions. And they're like, no, so it's not like a formal. I got this a lot. It's not formal. And I'm like, what is informal? Please tell me. So informal's name is TikTok. And yeah, like you know how it works. I mean, there's algorithms, and so you're being inundated with videos that are just sort of affirming and like validating that you have X diagnosis or Y diagnosis. So as I started to experience that as a clinician, I did a little bit of research. I found this fantastic article from Psych Today, and I was like, okay, people are talking about it. Like, this is relevant. It's not just me, it's relevant. I think I called you. I was like, are you getting this? What's happening? So just thought it would be really cool to talk about and say, all of us, like you said, all of us are consumers of social media, right? So if it's not TikTok, Instagram, etc. And so how do we move as clinicians, as individuals, when we know that this like larger force is so influential in our society? So I thought it'd just be like fascinating to get into.
Yeah, I'm imagining, clients scrolling through their phones and being like, I can't wait to go to therapy and tell my therapist like what my new diagnosis is. But I also, what I was just thinking as you were talking about this, what a kind of 180 this is from early in our career where people would, in the work that I did, I know I would talk to clients and they would deny and avoid a diagnosis and they would say, I don't have any mental health issues. And now we're getting clients, and I literally had a session last week where, we were talking about something, and he's like, it's a little bit of my like OCD tendencies, and I had this moment like, wait, when did you get diagnosed with OCD? We've been working together for months, and he was like, oh, well, no, it's not an official diagnosis, but just something I've seen on TikTok and Instagram, and I resonate with, and so. I think this is a really important topic to dive into because people are learning about their own mental health on social media, and that in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? We do want more people to learn and prioritize their mental health, and so it does seem that there are some positives here around social media in presenting mental health and connecting people so that they don't feel maybe so isolated in what they're experiencing. But I think there's definitely some problems here around that being a main way that people are learning about mental health, diagnoses, symptoms, and what that could mean for their own lives. So start us off, tell us like a little bit more about what you've understood around, what's been going on with this and what is the problem? What are we running into?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we want to think about is who is on TikTok, right? Because if the platform is just mental health practitioners, one, it wouldn't be popular, but two, then we could say, okay, there's like some clinical stuff happening. Any human on earth with a phone can be on TikTok. So what's problematic is that a lot of the advice that is happening is not from specific like clinicians. It's people. It's like just anyone who has a thought and wants to share. And it's also a platform that thrives on validation, likes, comments. Like there's a whole insular world here where you want to make popular content and you want some value to it, shock value or numbers and interests. So I think the biggest problem that we're running into is, well, I'm going to say two things. One, the therapy culture is being like the article in Psych Today laid it out so beautifully. It said normalization versus oversimplification. So to your point, lovely, wonderful to normalize that we're all going through things, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, life transitions, adjustments, but oversimplifying something like panic disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, like that's going to be really problematic. Bipolar disorder, where one, there could be like a psychosis piece to it, two, there could be like a medication component that could be needed. So we're really oversimplifying those things. And it was something like 83% of mental health advice on TikTok is misleading, like terrifying percentage
Mm.
and like stat to think about. And so that was like the most recent study that Psych Today quoted. And so to your point, I think, yes, we're talking about things more, we're normalizing these psychology themes, diagnoses. I think that's incredible. I think that's a huge pro. Like, let's get into it. Let's talk about it. Let's name it. The problem then becomes, are we accurately naming it? And secondarily, then are we delaying actual
Mm.
care from a professional that would be like imperative, helpful, important, etc.?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? Because, I don't use TikTok personally. I'm familiar with the format and I'm familiar with, some of the content makes its way onto other platforms. I've used a lot of Instagram and, that's another place where a lot of video based short form media where people are trying to talk about their own experiences with, let's say, like I see a lot of ADHD stuff specifically where people are saying, okay, my brain does this. I have a hard time focusing, or, you know, I I really struggle to stay organized. And, you can take a snippet like that, and that person may have an official ADHD diagnosis and say, hey, I also struggle with attention span and organization. Maybe I have ADHD, right? And then, where does that go from there is, with the algorithm, like you mentioned, then you start to see more of that, reaffirming, confirming, material on the platform. And then all of a sudden now you have this full blown belief that you have this, medical diagnosis, and maybe true or not, but I'm curious if you can dive into like the misleading part, because that's what I'm like, what does that actually mean? What does that do for folks who don't have that official diagnosis? And, then what do we do with that when they come to us with that information?
Yeah, first I just want to point out that it's absolutely hilarious that neither of us have a TikTok and we're doing this.
I definitely thought you had TikTok. I did
I
not realize that.
100% do not have a TikTok, but I
So
also feel
China
like,
or whoever owns TikTok right now, we're sorry for putting you down, but we're not.
yeah, I kind of just feel like Instagram Reel is also generationally more what like some of the older cats do here. But yeah,
I think maybe I think we can liken TikTok videos to Instagram Reels, to YouTube Shorts, to Facebook, whatever Facebook does nowadays, I don't know. But I think the format is across platforms. So yes, it's the TikTok diagnosis epidemic, but it is maybe the social media TikTok or social media diagnosis.
yeah, or we just need to get TikTok maybe. Okay, I'm gonna go back and remember your question. What do we do with somebody coming into our office? I'm gonna start there. What do we do when somebody comes in and they say, "Hey, like I have these four diagnoses, like I'd love to get started." And I will tell you from just my own experience as a psychologist, one of the biggest things And actually, you and I have shared this in case consultations. One of the biggest things I talk to clients about is that if you see a video or something online that resonates with you, send it to me. Like, email it to me. Like, I want to
Yes.
understand what you're connecting with. And you and I share that where we're just like, yeah, what is it that you're talking about? Let me see it. Let me hear it. Because that's so telling, right? And you also never want to like shame someone for being like, oh, you saw that on social media, especially like as a therapist, to be like, well, that's not real or that's not, no, that's not what we're trying to say. Because I actually think from a clinical standpoint, that's incredible data. Like they're seeing something, they're hearing something, and they're saying
Yeah.
100% that's me, that resonates with me. That is clinically significant. Now, is it an accurate depiction, like diagnostically? I don't know. But that's my biggest piece is like when you're coming to my office and you're convinced you have ADHD, right? Let's use that as an example. I really want to know, like, one, what is going on in your life, that could be symptoms of ADHD, but two, why are these videos connecting so much for you, right? Like we talk about so let's take a couple of steps back. Like we're talking about why TikTok itself or social media itself is so appealing, right? The themes around that is like we're validation seeking. Like we're just trying
Mm,
to get that input, right? Finally, someone gets me, someone understands me, like this is exactly me. That's 110% what these reels and shorts and TikToks are doing, right? They're making you feel like you're not alone. And so that's really clinically significant. The other piece is like confirmation bias. We talk about this loop all the time. Like people are looking for explanations that fit, but it's all from this bias, right? Like where it's like if you're getting 13 videos that are saying the same thing, you're going to get fed the algorithm where you're going to keep getting those types of videos and content. And so I think when someone's coming in, the most significant thing I could ask is tell me what you're feeling when you watch this
mm,
video and you're reading the comments and you're connecting to this video. Like, what is it about that? And 9 times out of 10, I get someone saying, like, I don't know, I was like embarrassed when I was a kid about like not paying attention, or I
mm,
felt like I procrastinate quite a bit, or like I'm kind of embarrassed, or there's this shame element, or I got yelled at by teachers and by my parents and I thought something was wrong with me. And so now you have this whole platform that's saying, hey, if XYZ thing was going on for you in your childhood, it might look like this in adulthood. Some of that information is like correct, right? Like how
mhm,
do adults present with ADHD versus children? Some of it might be misinformation. Like, for example, you don't want somebody on TikTok being like, hey, go to your primary care physician and ask for a stimulant. Like, you need to be tested. You need to know if you have ADHD, especially if like something's going on with anxiety and then you get on a stimulant and now, heart rate is through the roof. So we really want to be careful. That's the fear part. For me, like as a clinician, that's the part I think about, which is like how can we help like foster this idea that like you feel seen and
mm,
sift through some of that to be like, okay, now let's accurately try to understand what does that mean from a diagnostic perspective. If it's for medication, if it's for therapy and we're doing behavioral work, let's make sure we cater our work to that, right? Or like, let's send you to get some testing. Let's get into it. So that's kind of it for me. I'm curious if you've had, or kind of how you've handled this, if it's come through you.
I handle it the same exact way where and I usually do this at, almost every like first session or two. I will, especially if they have come in with some, preconceived notion of what's going on for them, which is again, great. And I think there's really a double-edged sword here because what makes social media so appealing is it reads what you are interested in, right? They take data from what you've been scrolling on the internet. They take data from what you've been scrolling on their platform, and they have really complex algorithms that predict what you want to see, right? I think we all have a story where, I have a story that I tell a lot where one of my first few months on Instagram, I had been working on this tattoo design, I'm pretty sure I've told you this story, but I was working on a tattoo design with a good friend of mine. I don't have any tattoos, so this never went anywhere. But he's a visual artist, and so he sent me a draft of this tattoo on Facebook. And then literally the next day on Instagram, I saw a t-shirt for sale in one of the ads that had almost the identical tattoo. It was just like in color and just changed. It was like a tree with roots and a DNA thing. And that was the exact same thing. I bought the shirt. It's my favorite shirt. I wear it all the time. It's got like holes in it now. That was like 10
I
years
love
ago
it.
or 8 years ago. Right. So that's really cool. Like it was really cool that happened. Me getting that shirt probably stopped me from getting the tattoo. I might come back to that. But I think, there's there's some stuff that we can frame as positive and good, and then there's stuff that where it crosses the line into, an area where we can't replace, medical diagnoses and healthcare with, what somebody who you've never met, who is doing this for the likes and the comments and the engagement, and potentially even is being paid for the videos they create to tell you what is going on with your health, right? And it's a very similar phenomenon to me as as WebMD was when it came out, right? What everybody thought they had cancer, everybody
Oh,
thought they had these really
100%.
rare
Yes,
diseases,
yes.
and, it's like, okay, you have a headache and a fever. That is, 95% of medical diagnoses. So you don't have, this thing that you're finding on WebMD. I think where it's actually, to me, not a problem if you come in with this, as a preconceived notion of what your diagnosis might be. I think where maybe it's problematic as well is if you then don't get healthcare treatment, if you don't get support from somebody who's trained and a professional in this. Look, as therapists, we are not the only ones that are going to be able to help you with your ADHD symptoms or your OCD symptoms or your bipolar symptoms. But if you are replacing professional support when you really need it with, also what's suggested on social, hey, just do this hack. That's another word that I have a problem with. I think sometimes is like, this is a biohack. This is a brain hack. And yes, there are shortcuts and tools and skills that we can implement that are relevant to what you're going through that are going to help. A lot of times, hack implies a substitute for something. And a lot of times, there's not a substitute for more long form work that is needed, especially with mental health, right? One thing I always tell my clients is like, if I could just tell you in 1 or 2 sessions what to do to just change everything that's going on, I would do that immediately. Like I would put myself out of business if I could do this in 1 or 2 or 3 sessions, right? Or if we could just knock this out in like a weekend, you spend a week, like I would do this, but that's not how mental health works because it is about being sustainable and long term. And so I think that's where sometimes we run into that as an issue with social media diagnoses.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and I think you're exactly right, and that leads me into kind of the next piece, which is like, why does the social media or TikTok feel safer than a therapist's office? Can you talk a little bit about kind of like what is maybe quote easier about just like hopping on the phone? I mean, I know the obvious, like your phone is right next to you, but what feels safer about just like getting online and and watching these videos versus really like coming into our offices?
Yeah, you get that instant validation. And, I just had a conversation too with one of our fellow therapists about a client that she was working with and, how much her client changed once she just validated and normalized what she was experiencing because she's surrounded by family members who are very invalidating and dismissive, minimizing of what she's experiencing. And so, a big part sometimes of the front end of our work is just validating and normalizing, right? And so sometimes I think social media can do that step for clients, or at least it feels like that initially. And so maybe that makes your symptoms more understandable. And because they're normalized, then you don't see them as dysfunctional. And so you might kind of just go back, hey, somebody else is experiencing this. I think there's something that goes on that makes them feel less isolated and then temporarily decreases the impact of whatever they're experiencing. Right. And so I think for them, it's okay, I think I'm okay because somebody else is feeling it when maybe that's not the whole story.
Yeah, and I think that's so well said because truthfully, like when you're coming in and you're feeling like the people around you are invalidating your experiences or you have a certain role in the family system and you're not getting that, there is really this like instantaneous community that exists in social media, in YouTube, in TikTok, in Instagram, and Facebook. And we've seen that culture over the years, right? you have friends that are online that maybe you've never met, but you have this really like close-knit community that's all going through the same thing. And what's so fascinating about that is that that's literally what Irv Yalom was talking about with group psychotherapy. Like that's real. Like that community is so important and exists to kind of help people normalize their experiences. And to social media's credit, like Facebook was one of the early platforms that came out with like grief groups and like I can remember a couple of groups. Like one was grief, one was parents of special needs kiddos, one was like I mean, there were several that came out that I remember clients coming to me and saying, I've never done therapy, but I'm part of this Facebook group. And I was so sort of floored by this idea that like somebody had gone through this really painful, difficult thing, decided to create a group, like how much courage that takes, and then invited people in to join who had had similar experiences. So I do think that's like a big reason too why people might not seek therapy right away is because they have this community that exists online. I think once again, a pro around it is that that community may also encourage like, hey, I'm in therapy, like you should go see a therapist. And so I do think it's normalized to get in with a therapist, but that was kind of one of my first thoughts is that there really is this like therapy type, I don't know, setup, I guess I would say,
Mm.
that exists, right? Not exactly therapy, but like this connectedness, the shared experience.
And I think it's vital. I think community connection, not feeling, like you're an outlier, super important in the mental health journey, right? And, and I think that that's where now it's probably important for us to talk about like what does it require for what are the differences in terms of how we approach diagnoses and how we approach, some of these things, right? Bipolar, OCD. These are probably two of the most commonly like defined and misunderstood diagnoses because we use them colloquially and I'm so OCD today. What? Nope. That's going against, one of the tenets in terms of how we diagnose. And so, you know, I think it's important for us to maybe point out both what goes into a mental health diagnosis and then what goes into mental health treatment and how does a TikTok diagnosis actually affect that? Okay, so talk us through. So the DSM-5 is the diagnostic statistical manual that we use for these medical diagnoses of mental illnesses and disorders. What are some of the common things that we see in the DSM-5 that help us make a diagnosis?
Yeah, so we're using the DSM-5 and we're really essentially in our appointments interviewing the client and gathering data. We're trying to understand patterns over time. ADHD is such a good example where a clinician would never diagnose, let's talk about kids. A clinician would never diagnose ADHD to a kiddo who's just experiencing things at school, right? It has to occur in two settings. So at school and at home has to look similar. And that's something that could be missed. Like there could be somebody watching a TikTok being like, man, that's my kid. They do all those exact things at home, but they could have different patterns. You hear this all the time. My kid's an angel at school or my kid's an angel at home. Like some environmental piece could be a contributing factor. And so patterns over time and consistency in settings is really important. Functional impact is really big. When we're looking at the DSM, we're looking at like how disruptive. OCD is a great example. You might feel like you have OCD because you compulsively clean. Is it impairing your function? Is there an inability for you to get through your day if you don't specifically do something in one way, right? We talk about those intrusive thoughts that exist. So there's so much like nuance that exists in these diagnoses. So really as clinicians, we're looking for several things. We're looking for rule outs. So sometimes like anxiety that comes from trauma can look very similar to ADHD, which can look very similar to OCD, right? Neurodivergence can look really similar in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Chronic like PTSD, bipolar disorder, we know, I think you mentioned this, chronically like misdiagnosed, right? Happens all the time. Most prominently, like when you're incarcerated, you can get misdiagnoses on a lot of this care. It can be minimized down to either depression. You can get overdiagnosed with something that's just like a common, like one individual in the setting you're in gets that diagnosis. Now everybody has that. So really there needs to be like collateral information. There needs to be like other sources that are going on. And then again, we're using our clinical judgment, we're using our training, maybe we're using some self-reports, some assessments, maybe we're consulting. We've talked about that at our practice. We hold case consultations where we're bringing cases to the group and saying, here's, several things I'm considering for a diagnosis. So there's really a lot that goes into, I mean, we don't take that lightly. And so I think it's really important to understand you can watch videos and feel deeply connected to something. Now, does that mean you have like 6 of the 7 markers of X diagnosis? No, it really doesn't.
I love that you brought up, the role of trauma and anxiety and stress, because sometimes that's, what we have to kind of weed through. And that's why it takes time, right? That's why we can't see our clients for 1 or 2 sessions and then send them on their way, right? Because we need to see what happens when they come back. We need to see when one stressor goes away, when a new one comes up, right? We're recording this at a time where all of our clients are preparing for the holidays, time around family. If we just took a snapshot of when people are at their Thanksgiving, family dinners and how they feel and how their functionality is, and we made that into a mental health diagnosis, that has, that's unethical because it's not true, right? It's taking a snapshot from a moment and applying it too broadly, right? And so, I think that's is super important piece of this, is that sometimes we need to understand kind of the chicken or the egg conversation in terms of, what comes first. A lot of the work that I do, especially with ADHD, is sometimes finding out, did the stress and trauma come first, or did that come as a result of under treatment of your ADHD diagnosis as a child, right? Or sometimes trauma can impact our executive functioning being the main part of our skill set that is impacted by ADHD, right? So if you had a traumatic experience, that can affect your executive functioning. And then we need to do some deep dives into understanding, when does that come up? How does that get triggered? And where do we start, right? How do we prioritize treatment? And that's, again, I think the last thing I'll add to this is sometimes coming in with a preconceived diagnosis narrows our scope from the get-go, right? And so we need to come in with a little bit of a blanker slate, I would say, so that we as clinicians, we can ask broad questions, we can do some sleuthing, we can do some investigating, ask the right questions, and then come back over the next several sessions and, okay, let's test this out. Have you been reflecting on this? Have you been thinking about this? What's been coming up? How's your mood been? And then that informs us in terms of, what is the accurate diagnosis? And, sometimes I've changed a diagnosis after months or years of working with a client because we've gotten to understand things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I mean, I've had the same exact experience. I think like the depth that you have as like a clinician to, the privilege that you get to work with somebody for years at a time, you're also just discovering so many different parts of them. And as individuals are ready to explore different parts of their life, diagnosis is changing. It can change, and that's true. And so I think that's actually essential to the work that we do is just kind of understanding the whole picture. And that kind of pushes me to think about too, like how do we reframe this conversation around TikTok? I think it's not going anywhere. It's like it's going to be here. It's here to stay. And so how do we sort of hop on board and say, okay, instead of and maybe this is in part like our clinical sort of responsibility is that instead of saying TikTok says that I have X diagnosis, right? TikTok told me I have OCD or whatever that language is when somebody's like coming in. How do we help reframe that? Which is like, hey, I watched a few of these videos. I feel like the symptoms that they talked about really connected with me. Like I really want to explore that. I really want to talk about that. I really want to understand that. Because the other piece is I also wonder why is it so important to get that label? Like, why is it so
Mm.
important to say, like, yes, I have the OCD diagnosis, like, I got it, right? In some ways, naming something can be really empowering. You can just feel this relief at times of, like, okay, it wasn't just me. I didn't make it up. It's not. and in other ways it can feel crippling. Like it can feel like, here's this label I have now, and like, what am I supposed to do with it? And so I also think it's so subjective that it's not always helpful to talk about the diagnosis specifically unless somebody's like coming in and saying, "Hey, I really want to get into it." So I'm always just fascinated by this young crew that's coming in and saying, "I have X, Y, and Z," because they really do, not to like generalize all of Gen Z, but like I do think there's more of an openness to say, "Yeah, I want to know what it's called. I want to name it. I want to get into it and see like what the treatment is." And I think that's pretty cool. And also just like you and I have been doing this for a long time. Not the case. Not the case with our own age group, not the case with the age group above us either. And so it is kind of a breath of fresh air sometimes to say, yeah, let's get into it and name it.
Yeah, and I think that's where, it can help. I think sometimes the pitfall of naming it too early is then you start looking for those things, right? So if somebody's talking about OCD, their OCD is on a spectrum of anxiety, right? So now all of a sudden I'm looking for things. Oh, I'm so obsessed with Chipotle, right? Like that's not OCD, right? And so,
Or
I
it,
think sometimes then I mean, it might be, but I think that's the thing is like then you go looking for those things. And when you're looking for things and you're doing it without, with an untrained eye or without a proper understanding of like what are we actually looking for, then, then you start to notice things and then over kind of compound the idea of what this diagnosis is. And then of course, if you're not sharing this with a therapist or your doctor or something like that, then that can, impact. One thing I wanted to add was sometimes these things are long term. Mental illness is not something that just shows up for a couple months or like a cold where it's like, oh, I have a cold the last couple of days. Sometimes it can lie dormant. When we're talking about bipolar, sometimes episodes can happen and they can be triggered by certain life events and then they can lie dormant for years even. And so this is also the importance of why we need to have a little bit more of this long form work with a professional to help with like really weeding through what is the diagnosis and what do I want to do about it, right? What are the correct kind of treatment goals that we can set that are actually going to improve my life functioning?
Yeah, and I love how you said that, right? Because you're also talking about this key point, which is like coming in with a social media diagnosis is essentially saying, I'm motivated. Like I'm here and I want to do the work, right? So
Mm, love that.
we're less looking into like what they're coming in with, but they're there, they want to be here and work on something that they're feeling like they could use assistance, guidance, growth, input, reflection with. And I just think like I'm here for that because that is kind of rare, I think, in the beginnings of therapy. There's a lot of, especially first timers that are coming in, there's a lot of anxiety around like what to expect. And so I really appreciate like just this entire frame of like, let's jump in. I think I have this. Do I not? So I mean, so let's shift. Talked about a lot of things. Kind of want to just like recap a little bit around takeaways, right, for listeners. Like, what can you tell me just kind of what can we take away from just using social media for these mental health diagnoses? What is the takeaway here in terms of TikTok sparking something, but not necessarily a diagnosis? Can you share a little bit?
So I want to start with the positive, right? That just to build off what you just said, because being able to connect and finally potentially have some answers for something you've been experiencing maybe for a long time is really important, right? And it can be, a huge load off your shoulders to finally name what you're experiencing. And look, social media, whatever qualms you might have with it, does provide community around certain topics that we have struggled historically to find community about, right? And so I think that's one thing, and really then that leads into messaging for us as clinicians, where I've talked to clinicians who are like, oh, I hate pop psychology, I hate social media, all of that stuff, but it's here to stay. There is a benefit, right? Just like with anything in moderation, there's a benefit. And so with social media, we need to have those boundaries, time boundaries, content boundaries, right? What am I looking at? Why am I looking at this? Late at night, right when I'm trying to sleep. And so I think that's definitely a piece of this where, setting those boundaries is always a good idea with social media, with really most things. But for us as clinicians too, I think we can approach it with some gentleness, with some, attempt at understanding kind of where they're coming from. And then also, again, to validate that they're making an effort, because that does, when clients come in ready to work or motivated to understand what's going on for them, it makes our jobs so much easier, and it makes mental health treatment therapy more successful. So it's a huge plus to some of this.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I mean, I think just being curious around what they're curious about, it makes our work like a lot more enjoyable, seamless, and I think there's going to be like this natural growth that occurs when two people are like, on the same page, and we're just kind of here and motivated and want to do the work. I think also we're talking about this idea where social media, it's opening a lot of doors for us. We have a lot of exposure, right, to things that we maybe didn't always understand. I mean, think about like pre-internet and like I know this is a long time ago, but we might have felt something and not known what it's called, and maybe there wasn't a comfort in talking about it. So when we normalize anxiety symptoms, depression, things like that, even cultural components of what we're going through, I think social media affords us that. There's a real light here where you just don't feel alone. And so I think it's really hopeful and encouraging that we're not moving in the world alone. And I think that that's huge. And that's maybe the biggest piece for me, is that there is this like deep connectedness that exists in social media. And we could say a lot of things about the negatives and the cons, but as a clinician, I'm going to kind of choose to look at the pros, and as I see the cons, like diagnostically point them out and sort of just like use that in real time as learning experiences of like what you're going through.
Look, my wife and I have built a nonprofit based off of social media, right? We started Brown Man Therapy as an Instagram page to connect with South Asian folks, men specifically, about mental health, because this is a population that doesn't come to therapy historically, right? And so we need to meet our clients where they're at, quite literally on social media, right? And so, I'm actually kind of shocked that I'm like ending up on the pro side of it. But, I think really, if I have to send a message to folks, this is not the end. If you are finding yourself connecting with something online that you have read or watched or heard, and you're saying, hey, this other person is sharing their experience and I connect with some of their experience, don't just stop there, then take that in to then do the work, right? If that's with a therapist or your physician, or you're not sure, then whatever you find on social media that you connect with, take it into the long form so that you can get something out of what you learn there, and definitely share it with us. I do think that sometimes clients, even though I'll invite them to share stuff, I think sometimes they will realize like, hey, do I actually want my therapist to watch this and then give me feedback on this? And look, I'm never against watching it because it's out there. There's no filter. Like Instagram, TikTok, they have like basic filters, but they're not filtering, is this actually accurate to the research that has been done over decades? Nobody is filtering information like that, right? And that has created this age of misinformation and disinformation. So with anything, with responsible social media use, is take this to somebody who then has some expertise in that field and get it verified for real. But don't just move on with your life, And last thing because I wanted to point this out earlier, is Adderall is the most, and stimulants are the most abused psychiatric drugs, right? Because people self-diagnose and say, oh, I got to study all night, so let me just take an Adderall from a friend who has ADHD and let me focus, right? This leads to then unhealthy practices, and that's what we really want to avoid. There's nothing wrong with connecting. There's nothing wrong with building community. There's nothing wrong with learning about something that you might have online, but what you do with that information is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just take it from two old people who don't have TikTok, like we're on the pro side. I think this is so funny. Um, I'm just like cracking up that we've never been on TikTok. But no, it's like really funny because I'm also just sort of like struck by the fact that I'm like, listen, this is a pretty good foot in the door. Like I'm here for it. And so I think the biggest takeaway that I can say is that TikTok, social media, that's a wonderful first step
Mm,
into maybe
mhm.
some reflection, right? And what you're saying, I love that you're saying this kind of second step essentially is like get hooked up with a therapist. Like, let's try to unpack that a bit more. Let's reflect. Let's like kind of figure out what's going on, because there's a reason why you're connecting to this content. And I think under the guidance, supervision, whatever of a mental health practitioner, we can really get the correct help and guidance. And I think that that's huge, right? Whether that's behavioral, whether that's medication management. So, I mean, you heard it here first. We're pro TikTok.
Even though neither of us have it, I have like tried to use it with the you got to like move the puzzle to unlock the
What?
video or
I don't
something
even
like
know what
that.
that
Just a
means.
couple times
I
I've
think you
gotten
use.
TikTok links, so
So you used to be able to, yeah, people, my friends would like send me stuff and then I click on it and it would like, now it just comes up, says you don't have TikTok. And I'm like, that's rude. But yes, it's true. I don't. So
yeah.
now you can't
Yeah.
even see or view the videos.
Yeah. So enjoy your TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit time.
Yes.
Please also talk to experts if you are connecting with something around mental health or mental health diagnosis that somebody's sharing. Remember, people are just sharing their own experiences. They're not necessarily professionals. Also, mix in some professionals. There's a lot of professionals out there on social media trying to educate, but none of them are going to diagnose you through a screen unless you're
Yeah.
in like a virtual therapy session. And so, really that you deserve individualized care and treatment if there is something really going on for you on the mental, physical side, doesn't matter. So start with TikTok or Instagram if you have to, but come see us and hopefully we can figure out what's actually happening.
Well, yeah. And check out Brown Man Therapy, because led by a real life clinician. We need more of that.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for another episode here. If you haven't heard any of our previous episodes, feel free to go back and listen to them. We talk about TV shows, movies, psychological topics, books, really anything of interest, of relevance to the world. So please check out the other episodes and we'll see you on the next one.
Okay. Bye.
Peace.